Quick warning, today's video contains content that some viewers may feel is sensitive, and as such, viewer discretion is advised. And if you have a true scary story you want to send my way, go to astheravendreams.com and click the Submit Your Story button. And thank you. So, this happened to me and my parents many years ago. Some of this is from my own personal memories, but also a lot of it is from my mom that she's told me about over the years. We lived in the UK at the time, and I was still a young child, about 8 years or so, just about to turn 9. My parents were religious at the time, but never really devoted themselves to a church. I didn't really remember ever going to church, but we did pray over our meals, or when we needed guidance, or when they would read from the Bible to me. Which I think is why they were so lured in at the time, as they didn't have a church they belonged to, so they didn't have anything really holding them back. We had a knock on the door, and I remember answering it with my mom, and there was a little old lady there with a basket of stuff. She started talking to my mom about if they were religious, or if they needed a home, and things like that. Then, my dad came over, and they were all talking. I remembered they invited her in, and she gave them pamphlets and gave me a small goodie bag that had a folded-up coloring page of a stained glass window with some kind of scripture under it, a few crayons, and a single piece of chocolate. They seemed to talk for a while because I remembered they were actually making dinner when this lady showed up, and I ate alone at the dinner table while they talked. When she finally left, my parents talked for a while about it, and finally decided that they would try going there that Sunday to see how they liked it. That Sunday, my mom and I wore our best dress, and my dad his fancy blue and silver collared dress shirt and tie, and we headed out. And the church actually appeared to be an old apartment complex that was bought out and turned into a live-in church. There was the main auditorium, or chapel thing, with a few staff rooms on the side, as well as a couple of public bathrooms. Then, and I'm going off our memory here, there was a nursery for infants and toddlers, one for kids ages 4 to 8, one for 9 through 12, and anyone 13 and up joined the adults in the main service. There was a reason for this that I'll explain later on, though. So I was put in what they called the kids' jam, while my parents went to the main service. Also, my mom explained that when we first arrived, since we were new, they immediately asked us who they were recommended by. She remembered this because it's normal for churches to get new members from anywhere without being invited. However, and she didn't think about this until later on, there were no walk-ins. If you were there, it's because you were invited, which should have been a red flag there. Anyways, the kids' room seemed normal to me at the time. It was colorful and had a few toys, but they were labeled boys and girls. The girls' toys consisted of baby dolls and kitchen cooking stuff, whereas the boys had a workbench, toolkit, and building blocks. We got to play for a while, but then we all had to gather while the adults read scripture to us. Apparently, my parents were both very happy with the service, and she said everyone was warm and welcoming, which was different from other new churches they had been to, where they were usually looked at funny for being new. So we ended up returning that next Sunday as well. My mom said they got several calls throughout the week, but they didn't seem like they were pressuring them, just more so checking in on how they felt about the service, how their week was going, things like that. which also turned them on to the idea of this place. So, when we did return, she said they were greeted by the pastor himself and his wife, asking them to join their congregation, which involved moving in there. Every floor above the first was still apartments for the most part, where other members lived, and the rent itself was practically free, as long as they donated to the church, which there wasn't a specific amount disclosed at the time, and they devoted their lives to them. My parents didn't see anything wrong with this, due to them struggling with the home they had at the time being costly, and they thought, how bad could it be? Living there, rent-free, making donations, attending every Sunday, and being able to save money, then if they felt like leaving, they could. Once they'd saved enough money so they could start making arrangements to move. Things started moving pretty fast from then on. I remembered when we got settled in, we had a few people come visit us, and we were told some of the stuff that we brought we wouldn't be able to keep as it wasn't part of their vision. Like my mom and I, we weren't allowed to wear pants or shorts, so those all had to be thrown out, only skirts or dresses. Men were allowed pants and shorts, but only on special occasions. Any toy that was not part of their vision or part of a woman's life, I was not allowed to have, which included my Barbie car and fake makeup kits. Then, we also had to get rid of most of our movies if they weren't approved by the pastor. We were allowed to keep our TV because they did have some kind of programming they pushed that were allowed, and I'm still unsure how they managed that. They also had their own library with approved books and movies too, so it was a huge adjustment. But we were already there and moved in, so my parents didn't feel like they could back out at that point. Then came the job issue. My mother was a bookkeeper at the time for a small local hardware store, and my dad was a car mechanic. The problem was, a lot of technology and electronics were not allowed. Since my mom worked on a computer all day, they suggested that she find another job, or she could work for the church as a bookkeeper and still get paid a normal wage. And since cars were technically a big computer, my dad was told the same thing. He instead worked for the church as well as a repairman. While my dad was fine with the changes, being that they no longer had to worry about losing their jobs, their home, or even bills, my mom was seeing things differently from her side. There was more involved than just being a bookkeeper. Since computers weren't allowed, she had to do everything by paper, pen, and a calculator. But she more so just kept track of how much everyone was getting paid that worked there, and how much everyone was donating back to the church. If the donations were under budget, someone higher up would first question her accuracy. Then, they would want her to figure out who didn't donate enough. Everyone was required to donate so much there, and if they didn't, it was tracked, as people went door to door in the apartments to collect it, kind of like mail. My mom then had to report that, and they were held responsible for it. My mother wasn't comfortable with this. She understood that we didn't really have to pay rent, but why were certain amounts required, and if they didn't have expenses other than toiletries and food, why would you need to keep extra money put up? Then she learned from one of the other girls there that the people that were under would have to pay up with either money, which they typically didn't have, or would claim they didn't have, or you'd have to pay with other collateral, which included property and children. Yeah, it was possible that your kids would be taken away if you were short donating. As for what happened to those kids, we still have no idea as we never saw them around. Things only got worse over the years. It became blatantly obvious what our lives would entail. My mother was nothing more than a moneymaker for the church. The best they ever had, they said. She had to be subservient to my father, making sure she was home before him with a clean house, dinner made, the works. All the while, behind closed doors, telling him this isn't a good place, and that she was worried. My father, on the other hand, loved it. The building was in decent condition, and a lot of the men worked on stuff there, so he never worked a full 8-hour day. He got to sit in a back office most days, waiting for someone to put in a request. If anyone gave him any trouble, he would report it, and they again would be dealt with in a manner that we never knew about. Then he got to come home and then not lift a damn finger while my mom stressed to make sure everything was right. He tried to calm my mom many times, tell her things like it would be okay as long as we followed the vision. I became distant with my father, as nothing I did seemed to interest him or was worthy of his time. I noticed he actually started favoring a young boy that he was teaching in his job. He talked about him all the time to my mother, about what he did, what was memorable. But when my mom brought up how well I did on a test, it hardly got more than, cool. School wasn't the best for me either. Of course, I was homeschooled in a way. One of the floors became the school. Boys and girls separated, of course. We were taught the minimums, like basic math and English. We read from the Bible, and then we had our role classes, which involved our gender-specific courses, such as cooking and cleaning for the girls. When I got older, and started attending the 9th through the 12th grades, and Sunday sessions, there were more classes added, such as how to take care of a baby, and clothes making, sewing classes. Some of the girls that I became friends with were great, and I became close to them, but other than that, I started feeling isolated and alone. My father obviously no longer cared. My mother definitely showed interest, but you could tell something was wrong. She was becoming a shell of herself, so I didn't have anyone to really talk to. Then the classes started to get even more real once I turned 13. I was now to join the adults in main service, and the classes also involved more adult-oriented topics, including choosing a career so I could prepare for the classes that I would need, as well as the birds and the bees. Since I'd been there at a young age, it wasn't really something that I heard or talked about with anyone, so to hear this the first time in class was awkward for me. Not to mention, my parents didn't exactly get a syllabus or a warning beforehand, so when my mom asked me what we learned, she was shocked. Their teaching was pretty cut and dry and suggestive. They basically explained that we're put here to be the womb for our husband and the earth, and therefore we should be thankful when we are chosen by a man, and so forth. However, my mother would also learn that that did not mean there would be a one and only. While the members were devoted to one man or woman, the pastor was devoted to any woman he wanted. And the last that she knew of, he had 9 wives at the time. And if he chose you, then you would now be devoted to him and your husband gets a chance at another wife. Not only did my mom work with several of his wives, she was also invited to be his 10th. She ended up telling my dad about this, and his only response was pretty much, do as you're told, I can find someone else. I know this broke my mom's heart as well, knowing that he didn't even want to fight for her, but she didn't want to become just another number either. At this point, my mother was already trying to find a way out, but it really cemented in her when I joined the first adult service. They always announced to the young boys and girls that are joining, but the looks and conversations with me at that point became weird. I had boys my age, up to my dad's age, approaching me, congratulating me and telling me how beautiful I was, and how much I would make a great wife and great kids. And this made both myself and my mom uncomfortable. Sometime around when this happened, my mom talked to one of the wives about all this, about becoming a wife in my future. She said she needed more time to think about it, and the wife said that that was fine, because we had to have a ceremony anyways for the marriage and the coming of age. So, she was told she had about a week to think it over. But it was also heavily hinted at that she did not have a choice. So my mom asked about the coming of age ceremony. She explained to her that it basically was for the girls that have turned 13, which was their legal age, the church's. And this meant that they needed to become a submissive wife, and that included having children. Her well-being was one thing, but she didn't want to subject me to any more than what I had already witnessed. So, my mom was ready to nope the hell out of there. Thankfully, she was in the right position to do this. By this time, being selected by the pastor and all, she was very highly regarded and trusted by the pastor and his wives, so she had access to the church's money and was able to leave the premises, unlike most people. With this, she'd been siphoning money as she did the books, making everything look fine, and taking some from my dad's wallet and stashing it in a hidden place. Then, the day before the ceremony, she asked to leave to go and get a few supplies to help make my dress for my ceremony, as well as a few of the pastor's favorite foods, as a thank you gift for choosing her, and she was allowed. Later that evening, after dinner, my father had actually left to go on a date, and my mom and I started putting things into motion. She was worried that I may say something, so she waited until the last minute to mention it. She had me run to grab my school bag and fill it with anything that I needed or wanted to take, which really was just some clothes and a few items close to me. My mom did the same, and we walked out. It was nerve-wracking at first, as there was a lady at the front that stopped to talk to us. She told her where we were going, checked the list to make sure we were approved, and we headed out. We walked for a while before we ended up catching a bus, which we were then on for an hour or so. My mom said she was just trying to get distance between us first. Then we made it to a shop and they let us borrow their phone. My mom ended up calling her sister, which she gladly invited us to stay with her, but she was still a few hours away. With a lot of looking over our shoulders, though, we finally made it. There was a lot of hugging and crying, and my mom was trying to explain everything to my aunt, as she hadn't talked to her since we had moved there. We basically planned to hide out there until my mom could figure out what to do next, but unfortunately we ran out of time. My father managed to get a hold of a phone and called my aunt looking for us. I remember being scared, and my mom telling me to be quiet, as my aunt was calm and collected the whole time. He asked if we were there, of course, or if she had heard from us, to which she said she hadn't for years. And then she started asking how he was, and if we were okay. He seemed to get more assertive in questioning her, but she didn't let it get to her. However, for her safety as well as ours, we made the decision to leave. She made it a lot easier for us, though, and actually bought us plane tickets to Canada. We called her from the hotel that we stayed in, and from there we lived free. It definitely wasn't easy, though. To say we were paranoid for a while, well, that's an understatement. We both cut and dyed our hair, and my mom went by her maiden name, and she actually helped me in changing my legal name as well, hoping to at least spot down the process of anyone trying to find us. My mom found someone new a few years after moving to Canada. He's not religious too, and he's been super sweet and supportive of both of us. They're not legally married though, as my mom is fearful that if she filed for a divorce, of course, my dad may find us and come looking. I think we all three agreed that we were okay with that. If we never run into anyone from that group or my father ever again, it would still be too soon. This is a long one, guys, but it's worth the read. It really freaked me out at the time. If anyone has a solid idea of what this was, or if they've had a similar experience, I'd love to hear it. This happened to me a while back, when I decided to go on another camping trip alone. I always liked camping alone. There's something serene and sobering about being isolated in the middle of the wilderness, and I always found it relaxing. So I planned out what trail I was going to take, packed my camping gear and my rifle for protection, and jumped in my truck. I get to this trail early in the morning and hike about 15 to 20 miles until I find the right spot, and head off the trail to find a place to put my tent up. I stumble upon this nice-sized clearing and decide that it's a nice, beautiful spot to settle down. I'm exhausted at this point, but I set up the tent at the southernmost edge of the clearing, next to the tree line, and I manage to get a fire going. I roast some weenies and start to hear a sound in the distance underneath all the forest noises. It sounded like an animal, most likely a deer, with a lame leg, as it sounded like the animal was making a walking/dragging noise. I felt bad for the poor guy, but it was too far away and it was getting dark, so I couldn't really go find it to put it out of its misery. I think nothing of it after that, and go about eating my food. After I eat, I douse the fire and crawl into my tent and insert myself into my sleeping bag. I decide that even in my exhausted and relaxed state, I can't go to sleep. So I pull out a book that I brought with me and start to read by the light of my lamp. Hours go by and I hear that sound again, this time closer, right at the opposite side of the clearing. Surprised, I put my book down and listen to this animal drag across the clearing towards my tent. It's really loud at this point, and it now sounds like the hooves are all being heavily planted, with the dragging noise following seconds after, like the deer is dragging something along. It makes it to about what I assume is the middle of the clearing, and stops. And I hear nothing. No breathing. Not a sound from this animal. I unzip the tent and look into the clearing, and there's nothing but trees and darkness. What the hell? Unnerved at this point, I zip the tent back up, and I sit there listening for the other noises. Nothing. Just the crickets and the breeze. I decide that there are a lot of strange noises in the woods, and I tried to not let it bother me. Besides, I had my rifle. I start to doze off when I hear men's laughter off in the distance to my right, and then women's laughter and sticks snapping far off to my left. I'm up now, wondering if what I'm hearing is really what I am hearing, or just a product of being half asleep. I hear more faint laughing from a couple other different directions, all different. In essence, old men, old women, even children, and I confirm that it's real. The noises are closing in, and I grab my rifle, preparing to fire a warning shot off in the air, in case they came too close. Something about this laughter, how far in I was, the noise earlier, and the time of night told me that this was not just another family strolling through. I was on edge enough already, but when I noticed that the nightlife was dead quiet, not even the wind was making any noise, I decided that enough was enough. I unzipped the tent and fired a shot into the night. I sat there and surveyed the tree line, but saw nothing. I listened intensely to my surroundings. No laughing and the forest sounds had returned. Relaxing just a bit, and figuring that I had scared off whoever, I sat down and in my exhausted state, I fell asleep. I wake up later in a cold sweat, racked with anxiety, and it was still dark outside. I immediately hear two people whispering not too far from my tent. Alert, I grab my rifle and listen to what they're saying. I can't make out much, but I hear something about being lost, so I shout, "Hey, who is there?" The voices fall silent. I shout again, "Are you guys lost? Who's there?" Suddenly, a huge burst of flame, like a flamethrower, erupted from the middle of the clearing, illuminating several silhouettes of people just standing around. In shock, I fire my rifle, blowing a hole in the front of my tent, and it goes dark. Without checking my surroundings, I get up and sprint out of my tent, making a hard left back to where the trail was. I hiked until sunrise back to my truck, with my head over my shoulder the entire way. I never heard anyone follow me, never saw anyone or anything the whole way, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. After that, my enjoyment of camping alone left me, just like I left all of my gear in the woods that night. Hi all. I've always lurked this subreddit, but it wasn't until today that I remembered something that I could post. Warning, a long read ahead. I'll try to keep it straightforward. So I dated a girl when I was 19 and she was 17. I've grown up Christian and she did too, but different denominations. She was Pentecostal. Her parents believed in homeschooling because their pastor at the time pushed it on the congregation. That was one of many things the pastors pushed that caused more grief in people's lives than they cared to admit. One day my ex revealed to me that the pastor's son had touched or assaulted many of the kids in the church, and it was of course overlooked and brushed off. She said she believed he did something to her, but she couldn't remember for sure and didn't want to play victim if nothing had in fact happened to her. I understood, and she went on to tell me that she never felt safe at the church, and that she hated her parents for blindly following the leadership of that pastor. She described it as a very cult-like church. Even though other churches she attended that were part of the organization didn't feel that way. I always got a bad vibe when she told me stories of her childhood and how messed up it was because of the church organization. So, anyways, that church that she went to when she was little, from birth to about 10, was in her hometown, and she had moved to my hometown since. One Saturday, I was really interested in learning about her hometown, not even thinking of the church. There were just cool points of interest to see. So we drove there for dinner and a little tour of her hometown. Things were going great, and then we were heading home a faster way according to Google Maps, when suddenly she says, "Wait, my church is down this way." I responded asking her if it was okay to take this way, if it made her feel uncomfortable, etc. She said it's okay and actually insisted that we stop by her old church so that I could see it. It was just getting dark out, but by the time we reached her old church, it was dark. She gave me a little tour from inside the car, showing me places they used to park, or where she'd fell and scraped her knee one time, things like that. She pointed to the back of the church and said that back there it used to be overgrown, but that they've put in a huge parking lot recently. I thought to myself, I guess they haven't installed any lights yet for it, so I shine my lights toward it, but nothing illuminates. I then turn on my high beams and nothing illuminates again. I drive closer, nothing. It was pitch black, and on each side of the church there's nothing except for neighbors' houses, but they're pretty far from the church. I start getting this awful feeling. I guess you could say dread. My ex was still in a that's weird state of mind. Because of her past history at this place, I didn't want to say anything, but she vibed it off of me and then felt that same dread. She started screaming, and that freaked me out even more. I slammed the car into reverse so fast, it turned it around, and I got the hell out of there. For at least 10 to 15 minutes, there was a feeling like something was in the back of the car. Something horrible. The funny thing is, I still had my high beams on, and they were piercing the dark just fine when we were on the road again. She called her parents, and they told us to get out of there now and that we should not have gone there. That creeped me the hell out. To this day, I remember it vividly. Since then, her and I have broken up because she started facing some tough times and wasn't receptive to any of the help that I was offering. Her parents divorced, and she then spiraled into drugs. It kind of makes me think if whatever was in the back seat may have attached itself to her. So that was 3 creepy cult-related stories. 2 of these stories you may have heard before on this channel. This was actually supposed to be a redone video. However, I had the longer and new story, so I chose to do that one and then post 2 of the older stories on this one as well. Would love to do more of these if I have the stories, though obviously these are very sensitive to some people, and I would never ever expect people to submit these, like, beyond what is already there, because they are very touchy. If you have been in a cult and you've escaped, you probably don't want to talk about it, and I totally understand that. So, huge thank you to everyone who lets me use their stories as well as submits their stories to me. Really appreciated, just so you know. All that said, friends, if you enjoyed the video, please do hit that thumbs up button. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing. Leave me a comment letting me know your thoughts, if you have any suggestions on what kind of video you'd like to see in the future, etc., etc. All that said, I hope all of you have a beautiful day. I hope I see you on the next video. But until then, my beautiful friend, sleep well.